Samantha, 25, had spent her entire life living with her mother. She never had the chance to meet her father, and over the years, she and her mother had developed an unbreakable bond. To make ends meet, Samantha took a physically demanding job at a massive warehouse. The work was grueling, and the relentless pace often left her completely drained. Still, she had no choice but to push through, especially since she relied on overtime to cover her mother's medical expenses. That particular week, things at the warehouse took a troubling turn. Management had announced that several expensive products had gone missing, and suspicions were running high. The higher-ups suspected that someone from either the barcode or inventory department was involved. They claimed that duplicate barcodes had been used to cover up the thefts, making it difficult to track the stolen items. Frustrated by the situation, the company launched an internal investigation, urging anyone responsible to come forward with the promise of leniency. Samantha had always kept a low profile at work, preferring to focus on her tasks without drawing attention to herself. She knew she had nothing to worry about. She was innocent. All she needed to do was show up the next morning, answer any questions honestly, and go about her day as usual. That evening, after finishing her shift, she headed straight home. The winter chill had settled in, and she prepared a warm bowl of soup for her mother, making sure she stayed comfortable despite the harsh weather. Samantha did everything in her power to make life easier for her, not wanting her fragile health to worsen. Exhausted from the long workday, she took a quick shower and collapsed into bed, hoping for a peaceful night's rest. Morning came too soon, and she woke up early, preparing for another day at work. As she sat on the bus, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over her. The warehouse had turned into a place of tension and mistrust overnight. Who could have stolen the items? What? Those thoughts swirled in her mind as she stepped off the bus and started crossing the street. Just then, she noticed a sleek black luxury car skidding out of control on the icy road. At first, she assumed the driver had lost traction due to the slippery surface, but before she could react, the vehicle veered sharply and crashed into a tree with a loud, jarring impact. Samantha froze for a second, stunned by what she had just witnessed. Then, without hesitation, she sprinted toward the wreck. Snow from the branches above had fallen onto the car, partially covering it. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone and quickly dialed 911 to report the accident. She knew every second counted. Rushing to the driver's side, she attempted to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The early morning streets were eerily empty, with no one else around to help. Desperate, she ran to the back of the car and popped open the trunk, rummaging through it until she found a metal golf club. Without wasting another moment, she swung it at one of the rear windows, shattering the glass. Reaching inside, she carefully unlocked the door from within. She moved cautiously, her every action driven by instinct. The driver, a man in his late 40s, was slumped over the steering wheel. His pulse was weak but steady. Then, something alarming caught her eye. Fluids were leaking from under the vehicle. Her mind flashed to scenes from action movies, the kind where cars explode after an accident. Not willing to take any risks, she immediately reached inside and turned off the ignition. When she leaned in closer, she noticed his breathing was labored. Without thinking, she loosened the scarf around his neck to give him more air. That's when she saw it, a deep gash on his forehead, blood trickling down into the collar of his coat. The sight made her stomach twist, but she pushed past her fear. Acting fast, she supported his neck and shoulders and carefully pulled him out of the car. Laying him on his side in the snow, she removed her knit hat, dipped it into the icy powder, and pressed it gently against his wound to slow the bleeding. As he lay there, his breathing grew steadier. A brief moment of relief washed over her, but deep inside, she knew that every second was crucial. Then, in the distance, she heard the piercing wail of sirens. Help was finally on the way. As the ambulance pulled up, Samantha let out a shaky breath, finally allowing herself a moment to process what had just happened. The paramedics rushed over, carefully loading the injured man onto a stretcher. Samantha, still holding the blood-stained hat, stood to the side, watching as they worked. Just as they were about to leave, her gaze fell on the front seat of the car. A phone lay there, screen still illuminated from an incoming call. Without thinking, she grabbed it, knowing it might be important. Then, as the ambulance doors swung shut, she made a split-second decision. She climbed inside with the medics, accompanying the man to the hospital. It wasn't until she was halfway there that she realized something critical. She was supposed to be at work. Panic set in. She had no way of explaining her absence, and in the current climate of suspicion at the warehouse, she feared the worst. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team immediately took over. One of the nurses approached her, asking for details about the accident. Samantha recounted everything as clearly as she could. After handing the man's phone to a nurse for safekeeping, she stepped aside and exhaled deeply, trying to calm the storm inside her head. Just then her own phone rang. She grabbed it quickly, her heart sinking when she saw the caller ID. It was work. Swallowing hard, she answered, barely managing to get out a nervous, "I'm on my way." But the voice on the other end was cold and sharp. "I never thought you were the type." Her coworker's words dripped with accusation. "So this is why you were always so quiet? You were the thief all along." Samantha's blood ran cold. "What? That's not true," she stammered, but her coworker cut her off. "Then why didn't you show up today? You got scared, didn't you?" Before she could respond, the line went dead. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The weight of the accusation crashed down on her like a wave, suffocating her with panic. She couldn't afford to lose her job, not when she was barely scraping by. Not when her mother depended on her. Without hesitation, she ran outside and hailed a taxi, throwing every last dollar she had at the driver. "To the warehouse. Fast," she pleaded. The entire ride was a blur. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to make sense of how she had suddenly become the prime suspect. When the taxi finally screeched to a halt in front of the warehouse, Samantha jumped out and rushed inside. The moment she stepped through the doors, the entire room fell silent. Every pair of eyes locked onto her, their gazes filled with suspicion and quiet judgment. She didn't stop to acknowledge the whispers or the way people stepped back as she passed. Instead, she marched straight to the management office. Inside, the manager sat at his desk, his expression unreadable. But the moment she entered, he folded his hands and spoke with an icy calm. "Multiple employees have reported suspicious behavior on your part," he said. "And disappearing on a crucial day only makes you look guiltier." Samantha's breath hitched. "I wasn't hiding. There was an accident." The manager cut her off with a humorless laugh. "An accident? How convenient." Her throat tightened. "Please, you have to believe me. I was helping someone. Check my phone. I called 911. I can prove it." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, scrolling frantically to her call log. But as she showed it to him, the man merely smirked. Someone who's smart enough to manipulate barcodes is also smart enough to fabricate an alibi, he said smoothly. The words hit her like a slap. She felt the ground tilt beneath her, the weight of helplessness crushing her from all sides. It was over. The meeting ended with a cold, formal announcement. She was fired, effective immediately. Numb and disoriented, she stumbled out of the office, surrounded by the silent, piercing stares of her coworkers. Shame burned hot in her chest, even though she had done nothing wrong. She had lost her job. She had lost everything. With no money left after paying for the taxi, she had no choice but to walk home in the freezing cold. The wind cut against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too clouded, too overwhelmed to feel anything but despair. By the time she reached her front door, she was frozen to the bone. But the moment she stepped inside, her mother's concerned eyes met hers. "What happened?" her mother asked gently, sensing something was terribly wrong. Samantha's resolve crumbled. The tears she had been holding back came rushing forward as she collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. And for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what to do next. Samantha sat on the couch, curled up beside her mother, trying to regain control of her trembling breaths. Her mother gently stroked her hair, waiting patiently as Samantha poured out everything: the accusation, the humiliation, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Her voice shook with frustration. "Mom, they fired me without even listening. They think I stole from them." Her mother's face fell, her eyes filling with worry. "Oh, sweetheart, that's so unfair. Can't we fight this? Maybe take legal action?" Samantha let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her damp cheeks. "With what money? We can barely afford your medicine. A lawyer is out of the question." Her mother exhaled, sorrow evident in her tired expression. "I hate seeing you go through this. You don't deserve it." Samantha took a deep breath, forcing herself to sit up straighter. As much as she wanted to wallow in her misery, she knew that wouldn't change anything. If she had learned one thing in life, it was that nothing ever magically fixed itself. She had to keep moving forward. She reached for her mother's hand and squeezed it, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. "Hey, things like this happen. It's not the end of the world, right? There are plenty of other jobs out there. I'll find another one." Her mother still looked concerned, but she nodded slowly. "I know you will. You're strong." Samantha forced a smile. "Exactly. Now, let's not waste the day being miserable. I'm going to make us a big breakfast. How about some pancakes?" Her mother chuckled softly, touched by her daughter's attempt to lift the mood. "That sounds wonderful." As they sat together at the table, eating their simple but comforting meal, a new determination took root in Samantha. She wouldn't let this injustice define her. She would find a way to turn things around. The next morning, she woke up early, feeling more resolute than ever. She needed a plan. With no job and barely any money, she had to act fast. Her first thought was to check for job openings nearby, but after hours of searching, she came up empty. Most businesses weren't hiring, and the ones that were required qualifications she didn't have. With each rejection, the reality of her situation weighed heavier. That's when an idea struck her. If she couldn't find a job in her neighborhood, she would have to look elsewhere. Maybe the city would have better opportunities. But there was a problem. She didn't even have enough money for a bus ticket. Her gaze drifted to her phone on the table. It was one of the few valuable things she owned. Selling it would give her just enough cash to get by for a few days. Biting her lip, she made up her mind. She walked to the nearest electronics shop, hesitating only briefly before handing over her phone. The cash they gave her wasn't much, but it was enough. With her last bit of energy for the day, she mapped out a plan. First thing tomorrow, she'd head into the city and find work, no matter what it took. As she made her way home, exhausted but determined, she had no idea that, at that very moment, someone else was looking for her too. Meanwhile, in a private hospital room across town, James Carter slowly opened his eyes. The last thing he remembered was losing control of his car before everything went black. Now, as he blinked against the bright hospital lights, a nurse stood beside him, a relieved expression on her face. "You're awake," she said gently. "You gave us quite the scare." James tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The nurse handed him a glass of water, and he took a few slow sips before attempting to ask, "What happened?" She smiled reassuringly. "You suffered a heart attack while driving. That's why you lost control of your car. Luckily, a young woman found you just in time and saved your life." James frowned, trying to recall any memory of his rescuer, but his mind was blank. "Who?" he asked. The nurse's smile softened. "We don't know much about her, only that she stayed with you until the ambulance arrived. She even rode with you to the hospital, but she left before we could get her name." James's heartbeat quickened, not from illness, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude. Whoever she was, she had risked her safety to pull him from that wreck. And now, she was gone without a trace. He wasn't the kind of man to let something like that go unanswered. With effort, he pushed himself upright and reached for the phone beside his bed. "Find her," he told his assistant over the line. "Whatever it takes." Samantha had no idea that the man she had saved was searching for her. And as she prepared to leave for the city the next morning, her life was about to take a turn she never could have expected. Samantha tightened her coat against the biting wind as she made her way to the city. The morning was brisk, and she felt the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Still, she forced herself to push forward. There was no time for fear or second-guessing. She needed a job, and she needed it fast. As she stepped off the bus, she was met with the overwhelming sight of towering buildings, busy streets, and a steady flow of people rushing past her. The energy of the city was both thrilling and intimidating. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out the crumpled list of places she had written down the night before. One by one, she visited every store, cafe, and office that had a "now hiring" sign in the window. But each rejection chipped away at her hope. Some places weren't hiring anymore, others required experience she didn't have, and a few simply weren't interested. Hours passed, and her legs ached from walking. Her stomach grumbled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten all day. She leaned against the cold glass of a storefront window, rubbing her hands together for warmth. This was proving to be harder than she had expected. With no money left and no job in sight, what was she supposed to do now? Meanwhile, across town, James Carter was growing impatient. His team had tracked down a few key details about the woman who had saved him. They knew she had left the hospital in a rush, had taken a taxi to a warehouse, and had been fired shortly afterward. One of his employees had even managed to obtain her name, Samantha Reynolds. James exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his normally composed demeanor. The more he learned about her situation, the more it infuriated him. Fired? Accused of theft? All because she had been late after saving his life? Unacceptable. He had spent years building a career as a high-profile attorney, fighting for justice in cases far more complex than this. And now, he had every intention of using his skills to set things right. "Where is she now?" he asked, glancing at his assistant. "We're not sure," the man admitted. "She doesn't seem to be at home, and her phone has been disconnected. But we know she was looking for work. If she's out job hunting, it's only a matter of time before we find her." James nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "Then let's not waste any more time." Back in the city, Samantha was at her wits' end. The sun was beginning to set, and she had no idea where to go next. Just as she was about to call it a day, she spotted a small cafe on the corner of the street. With a sigh, she decided to try one last time. As she stepped inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air. A young woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Hi, welcome to Rosie's Cafe. Can I get you something?" Samantha hesitated before clearing her throat. "Actually, I was wondering if you're hiring?" The woman's smile faded slightly. "Oh, we just filled our last spot this morning. I'm so sorry." Samantha forced a polite nod, though disappointment gnawed at her. "No worries. Thanks anyway." As she turned to leave, the door suddenly swung open. A man in an expensive suit walked in, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room before landing directly on her. Samantha blinked, startled. She recognized him instantly, James Carter. Her breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? James approached her with a purposeful stride, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "I've been looking for you." Samantha felt her pulse quicken as James stood before her, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. The noise of the cafe faded into the background, replaced by the rapid thudding of her heart. "You've been looking for me?" she echoed, still trying to process the fact that this man, the same one she had pulled from a wrecked car, was now standing right in front of her. James nodded, his expression serious. "Yes. I owe you my life." Samantha swallowed hard. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone else would have done." His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I don't believe that for a second. Plenty of people would have kept walking, but you didn't. And now, because of what you did, I'm here. Breathing. Standing. Alive." She glanced away, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not from someone like him. James took a deep breath before continuing. "I also know what happened at your job." Her stomach dropped. "Oh. I know you were fired. That they accused you of something you didn't do." His tone darkened, a hint of anger flashing in his eyes. "It was wrong. And I plan to make sure they face consequences for it." Samantha let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. They've already made up their minds. Nothing I say will change that." James leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something softer but just as resolute. "You're right. They won't listen to you. But they will listen to me. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? He straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. I'm a lawyer. And not just any lawyer. I specialize in cases like this. Wrongful termination, defamation, corporate misconduct. He met her eyes again. What they did to you is not only unethical, it's illegal. And if you're willing to fight, I'll fight with you. Samantha stared at him, trying to wrap her head around what was happening. She had spent the past 24 hours feeling utterly powerless, and now, here was this man, a stranger, offering to go to battle for her. It felt surreal. She hesitated. Why would you do this for me? James tilted his head slightly. Because it's the right thing to do. And because I can. She didn't know what to say. A part of her wanted to accept his help immediately, but another part of her, the part that had learned to be cautious, to expect disappointment, held her back. As if sensing her hesitation, James sighed. I know this is a lot to take in. I won't pressure you. But I do have one more offer. She raised a brow. Another offer? He nodded. Until we sort this out, I want to offer you a job. Her eyes widened. A job? Yes. You saved my life. Now, let me help you rebuild yours. Samantha blinked, stunned. But I don't. What would I even be doing? James gave her a small, confident smile. I could use an assistant. Someone reliable. Trustworthy. Quick on their feet. He crossed his arms. Sound like anyone you know? She stared at him, struggling to find words. Was this really happening? James chuckled at her speechlessness. You don't have to decide right now. But think about it. I'll handle your case either way, but this job offer stands. Samantha inhaled deeply, her mind spinning. In less than a day, she had gone from unemployed and hopeless to having a powerful attorney in her corner and a potential new job. This wasn't at all how she had expected her life to change. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her. Samantha sat across from James in the quiet corner of the cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She was still trying to process everything. His offer, his determination to help her, and the fact that, somehow, her life had taken a completely unexpected turn in just a matter of hours. James watched her with quiet patience, as if he understood she needed time to let it all sink in. Finally, she exhaled sharply and met his gaze. I don't know anything about being a legal assistant, she admitted. James smirked slightly. You think I was born knowing how to be a lawyer? Everyone starts somewhere. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. I don't need someone with legal experience. I need someone who works hard, pays attention, and doesn't back down when things get tough. From what I've seen, that sounds a lot like you. She bit her lip, still hesitant. It wasn't that she didn't want the job, it was that she didn't want to believe something this good could actually happen to her. What if I mess up? She asked quietly. James chuckled. Then you learn. Mistakes aren't what define people, it's how they handle them that matters. He studied her carefully. I won't offer this to you again, Samantha. Either you take a leap of faith, or you walk away and keep looking for something else. She swallowed hard, gripping the warm cup in her hands. A part of her was still afraid, but another part, one she hadn't listened to in a long time, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Then, with more confidence, she repeated, I'll do it. A slow, satisfied smile spread across James's face. But you won't regret it. Something told her that he was right. The transformation in Samantha's life was almost unbelievable. With James's help, she had filed a case against her former employer. The lawsuit alone was enough to shake the company, and after weeks of pressure and mounting evidence proving her innocence, the management finally admitted their mistake. Not only did they issue a public apology, but they also agreed to compensate her with a substantial settlement. The money meant she could finally breathe. She was able to cover her mother's medical expenses, pay off lingering bills, and even start saving for the first time in years. But even more importantly, she had reclaimed her dignity. She had won. And then there was her new job. Working for James was unlike anything she had ever done before. The pace was fast, the stakes were high, and the legal world was a maze of rules and negotiations she barely understood, but she was learning. Every day she sat in on meetings, took notes, organized files, and watched James work. She was fascinated by how he built cases, how he could turn words into weapons and use them to bring down corporations twice his size. He was brilliant, but he was also demanding. Yet, for the first time in her life, Samantha didn't mind the pressure. It made her feel like she was part of something bigger, something meaningful. One evening, after a long day, she sat across from James in his office, sipping a coffee and going over case notes. "You're getting good at this," he remarked, flipping through some paperwork she had organized. Samantha smirked. "Are you admitting I was a good hire?" James raised an eyebrow. "I'm admitting that I don't regret my decision." She laughed, shaking her head. "I'll take that as a compliment." James leaned back in his chair, watching her with a look she couldn't quite decipher. "So, what's next for you, Samantha? Now that your name is cleared, now that you have options, what do you want?" She hesitated, then smiled thoughtfully. I want to keep going. Keep learning. Maybe even go back to school." He nodded approvingly. "I think that's a great idea." She exhaled, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Her life had changed in ways she never saw coming, but somehow, it had all led her here. And for the first time in forever, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And this was just the beginning. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your interest and support inspire us to bring you more captivating tales filled with emotions, twists, and the complexity of life, love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We value your voice and want to hear what you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for bringing this channel to life with your views and encouragement. See you in the next story.